And we welcome all of you who are with us today. This is Steve Larson of the Hoards Dairyman staff, welcoming you to another one of our monthly webinar series. We appreciate having Leo Timms from Iowa State with us today. We also want to say hello to Mike Hutchins and his cohort Jim Baltz down at the University of Illinois, our partners in this venture. I'm looking forward to hearing Leo's comments today on what we can do for teat health and milk quality here in the coming months. I'm sure we'll have some cold weather yet. And we also want to extend our sincere thanks to Kuhn for their sponsorship of this webinar today. So with those comments, again, welcome to all of you who are out there. Mike, I'll turn it back to you and let you introduce our presenter.
Very good. It's my real honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Leo Timms. Dr. Timms grew up in eastern Pennsylvania. His brother on a dairy farm with 50 cows over there. Got his undergraduate degree at Cornell University. Then after getting his bachelor's degree, managed a 350-cow dairy herd in western New York State, and then came to the University of Wisconsin. So he's probably feeling a little glum also over the football situation. Got his master's and PhD under Dr. L.H. Schultz there in 1984, and then went to Iowa State and was been there ever since, leading a very productive milk quality and teaching and research program over there 30-plus years. So, Leo, without any further ado, let me turn the program over to you, and welcome to our webinar.
Well, greetings, Mike and Steve. Thanks for the opportunity to do this, and I think we'll just launch. I'm really pleased today to visit with you a little bit about strategies, actually winter strategies, that we hopefully can give you some ideas that will enhance teat health and milk quality as we move into the winter. Really why and what to do. And you can look at this picture. These are Illinois cows, and I think we know what last winter was. But I lost my slide for a second there. But in fact, this was looking out my back door last winter. One of those days, we all know it was cold, but my thermometer said -17, which of a Celsius person, that's -35. About a 4 mile an hour wind, and a 4 mile an hour wind at both of those, they're both -40 some. So that's where Fahrenheit and centigrade cross. And I don't think it matters whether it's Fahrenheit or centigrade. I think you'd all agree that that was pretty bloody cold, and the winter really was harsh last winter. But I thought I'd start with this. I think a lot of times people think about winter and they think about heifers and they think about either frozen teats, or hopefully you don't see this, or something called herpes mammilitis. Oftentimes see frozen teats, or again herpes mammilitis, particularly in fresh heifers. If it's mammilitis, we know when we see this can be a contagious situation. You really want to be concerned about spread. It's a spreadable bovine herpes virus. When the teats look like this, again, whether they're frozen or herpes mammilitis, they're painful, they swell, they tend to get red, they get leather-like skin, and obviously hard to milk, hard to deal with, so they need tender loving care. But obviously if it's frostbite and you can get over it, or certainly herpes mammilitis, it usually lasts 2 to 8 weeks, and essentially you'll have lifetime immunity. That's assuming that you can take care of that animal without getting any mastitis. So whether it's frostbite or other injuries, or particularly herpes mammilitis, besides control and spread, it's really trying to keep those teats disinfected, soft, and healthy. Make that tissue heal as best you can. And you do that, as usual, excellent germicides and skin conditioning dips. We'll talk about salves later. If you're going to use them, they are very specific in terms of germicide, and in terms of where their use is very limited. But probably the most important thing, it's like your hands in winter. When you start to get those cracked fingers and hands, you can't just dip once or twice. You've got to use those compounds judiciously and repetitiously, and maybe even cover, to enhance the healing of some of these bad-looking teats. But I want to turn to this. Number one, if it is herpes mammilitis, we need to think about control on a potential spread or problem, even if it's freezing temperatures in these heifers. But I'm just as concerned about controlling some of those other stressors. Certainly the milking machine is going to be a stress in itself, and exposure to cold weather. But I really want to talk just quickly about edema. Herpes mammilitis in the vet manual is actually called edematous mammilitis, because it's really edema that sets up a situation of very, very poor circulation in that udder, and actually sets up this animal to either have mammalitis or freeze, and that's all animals. So I think as we start to see winter come along, it's really trying to control edema in these transition cows, and particularly heifers, either with, if it's an individual cow, we might do some pre-calving milking, but if it's a whole host of them, we might really look at our rations and our things that can control that issue. So what I really want to turn to is teats that maybe don't look as bad, but we know this looks pretty bad. And for years, when winter hit, we'd all look at teats like this. We wouldn't even have to turn them over and say, yep, winter's here. We used to say, yes, it's another herpes virus, just like a cold sore. We've proven that it isn't that, but essentially for years we treated it like a cold sore, contagious mastitis, and did the right things, I think. But essentially, I'll share with you today, it isn't viral in origin. So what I'd really like to do over the course of today is have 4 objectives. Number 1, I want to talk about just what's normal. We tend to think of what's abnormal, but really never take a step back and look at teat ends and teats and define what normal is. Number 2 is the factors that affect this, particularly focused today on environmental situations and weather. I'd like to then show you our work, but then some of the research we've done on a lot of winter products, and really it'll just highlight some of the key points about winter conditions and things we should think about. And finally, the last half is really home in on strategies and technologies for prevention or minimizing mastitis and enhancing milk quality, especially in the wintertime. So let's see what's normal, and obviously that's a normal cow. So I want to focus at the end of the teat and ask you, what do you think is normal when you look at the end of a teat? So I'm going to put a poll up here and say, what is the predominant teat end shape? And there you go.
Well, the polls are open. Steve, have you voted yet? I'm not sure Steve is muted. Steve might be muted. Anyway, we are voting, so let's all vote. And boy, we got a bunch of...
I was muted.
You were muted. Have you voted?
Yes, I have.
I see.
We will see how well I do.
All right. Well, we got 72% of the votes in here at 30. So the Democrats, Republicans, we must be working here. Leo, let's go ahead and close it off at almost 80%, and you tell us what did you see and what do you think?
Well, the winner in this, Mike, is round at 65%, followed by flat at 13. Funnel at 9, and then the 7 at prolapse and 6. So I'm going to tell you, maybe Democrats or Republicans, but I'm going to convince you that maybe you're Holsteins, and I'll go back to my next slide. All right. Well, let's see what research tells us. And in fact, this is well done research, mostly from the Holstein breed. About 60% are going to be round. About 15% funnel shaped, where that teat end goes in, or flat across. And that looks pretty similar to what you saw in the pools. But you have these 2 shapes up at top, which only about 5% or less. This prolapse, where the teat end juts out a little bit, or plate shape, where it funnels in, but then again, that teat shape comes out. And I'll come back to these. Now, if I looked at jerseys, they'd be more about 80 to 90% round with some of these. If I looked at some of the other colored breeds, we tend to have some more flatter and funnel shaped and a little less round. But every breed having similar patterns to some of these 2 on top. So the question is really, why is that important? And it's right here. Because we forget that the end of that teat end, its shape, is very heritable and repeatable. So from generation to generation, if we have some teats that maybe aren't desirable, they're going to carry on unless we think about it. The other one is the correlation between that shape and 2 things that happen at the end of the teat we're going to talk about today, either thickening or callousing and or cracking. There's a very good correlation when we have inverted or flat teats and maybe even some round, that abnormality of thickening and or cracking goes down, why those pointed teats, those ones that are the dish-shaped or the prolapse ones where that teat end is out, are just more prone to have problems, even with good milking equipment, even with reasonable weather. Now, when we look at the correlation of that shape in cell count, that's where the data gets muddy. It's kind of mixed and inconclusive because people have put all the shapes together. I'm going to convince you today that if we look at pointed teats, or those ones in particular, we'll see a fairly good correlation with cell count and mastitis risk. So if we think about that, gives you an idea what's normal. So what influences change? And then we have a couple papers. There's lots of things. But if you think about it, this is where the job is done. Milk coming out of there, and certainly that's where bacteria that cause mastitis get in. So trying to maximize the end of that teat. So we know things that are going to affect it. Simply, often, even if you just cut it or you have a chemical burn, usually not. Flies in the summer, certainly some types of infections, like you saw with mammilitis. But we really know things like milking machines and practices that influence that teat. Every milking can have a role, and we'll talk about that. And certainly we know that weather conditions, particularly winter, and we'll talk about that. And what really is the problem is that once that teat end gets compromised, we oftentimes may or may not, depending on our management strategy, see cell counts go up or clinicals increase. And oftentimes that happens long before that we even look at a teat or decide if there's any problem with teat end health. So what I'd like to do today initially is just talk about what's normal. And I'd like to take you to a study we did in 1998 and 99 where we looked at an entire herd of 164 cows or 600 and some teats for a full year, where we intensely tried to look at the ends of teats and just see how they changed irrespective of cause or problem. So we look at shape and length. Those are important in condition, but the important thing is we scored those teats, the skin and the ends, by 1 to 2 people, sometimes 3 people, every 2 to 3 days through the fall, winter, and spring, and then weekly in the summer. There were less changes, but still very, very intense, just looking at what happens normally with teats in this single herd. I'll allude you to what this scoring system is, and I'll make it fairly simple. Remember I said whether the teat thickens up or calluses. We call those donuts, and I think most of us know what that is. That's called hyperkeratosis, and whether it has a crack or not. And I'm going to convince you it's extremely important to differentiate those two. So on the left side, a 1 is a normal teat. It's fat, it's flat, it may be inverted, but it's pretty normal. And then as you can see, every half point we go up is a degree of thickening. So we get a little donut or thickening, a callus, and in fact, once you get to 2.5 and 3, those are visible calluses that you can see without turning a teat over. So these you have to turn a teat over. These you can see, you know that they're big teats, but they're smooth. On the other side is just teats that now have that same degree of callusing. So when I go up a half point from 1, now I go up a half point, I have, again, a very, very mild thickening, but more importantly, that's associated with some kind of crack. And we tend to see these in winter, like your fingers, where we get these real rapid cracking without a lot of thickening initially. I think we all know what a 4.5 and 5 is. Those are teats that are very thick, very large, and they look very bad. They're very, very rough, and they have a lot of thickness to them. And so that's our scoring. If you think about it, anything less than 3 has no compromised skin, it's just smooth, and anything above that is a 5. So my second poll question I'm going to open is, okay, so how fast do you think these teats can really change, particularly in winter? How fast can that tissue change in front of you? So let me go to the poll, and I'll open it up.
Okay,
so here we go.
I have my choice. How is the voting doing?
Well, it's off and running here. Wow, Leo, I don't know. I've never seen such fast voting before. My number is, I'm going to pick 24 hours. Steve, what did you pick?
That's what I picked. Yep.
I guess 24 hours. I was torn between 12 and 24, and I don't see the right answer on my sheet here. So anyway, we're there, Leo. Let's close it off and share it. We got 70% of the vote in. And
okay, so there's the poll. Obviously, you all chimed in quick. 30% say less than 12 hours. Another 34% say obviously 24 hours, and then there's another third with 3 days. Nobody says 3 weeks or never, and I think that's good. But I can tell you, for a long time, people didn't think it changed. A lot of companies didn't think it changed, or could change that fast, and we would hear that. So you'll see in a minute just how rapidly they do change and who was right. And I think any one of these you'll see in my slide set could probably be right. So this is what a year's worth of teat ends looks like. And again, there's a lot of clutter here. I'm just gonna show you. This is, if you multiply these by 100%, you'll get the number. What's on this graph quickly, and I'll unmuddy it in a second. These are teats that essentially 1 to 3. They are smooth. They either are normal, or they have a mild thickening, or really a very large thickening, but they're all smooth. So we would say probably limited risk of mastitis. And I'll just add these 1s and 2s up, pretty normal, and they're somewhere around 70 to 90%. The point I really want to make is this group down here. They're the ones we tend to get hung up on. They're those large donuts. They're smooth. We know that actually they're not a mastitis risk, but if you can see, it's a pretty normal level. It's about 3 or 4%, maybe up to 5%, a few blips, but again, the ones that we tend to make all our decisions on is an extremely small percentage of the teats. So if you want to think about it, maybe these are the bad guys over that year. These are the ones that have cracks and roughness that have an enhanced ability to score to give you mastitis. So I want to start on this bottom line. These are the really bad ones that we tend to look at and make all our decisions and changes on. These are the ones that score 4.5 and 5. Large teat ends, very rough looking, cracked, and certainly we know they have a mastitis risk. But lesson number one is, when you look at the last slide in this slide, there's a very, very small constant population of bad teats with large donuts, with or without cracks, and certainly even a smaller one that really look bad. And if you go back to my genetics slide, in a normal herd, that's just going to happen just because we're going to have some of those unique and bad teat end shapes that just normally get like that. What I'd really draw your attention to are these ones where there's not a lot of thickness, where you have to turn the teat over to literally see that crack and that thickening, that mild. And you can see these very, very rapid changes here, all associated. Every one of these changes is all associated with a change in temperature, including this May when we had a snowstorm, or this fall when it was 37 degrees, but the wind came up and it was 60 degrees the day before. So lesson number two is, all of a sudden we had this monstrous variability in percent of teats that looked normal, but then all of a sudden would crack. And then maybe it would go away in essentially a matter of days. So this is the same slide, those same slides, but now all I'm doing is, this is the proportion on here is the top that score without any, we would say no risk of mastitis. Yes, they may have some thick teats in a small percent, but they're pretty normal. And here's that population of cracks, mostly minor, mostly crack with minor thickening, and we know have an enhanced risk for mastitis. Again, oftentimes these are on top of a weather change. So lesson number three is really the answer to the poll. Teat ends can crack and occur, and you can see very rapidly. I'm going to say 2 to 3 days because we were scoring at a 2 to 3 day interval. But we now know that that can happen literally in a matter of 12 hours if those changes, and I'll show you that in a minute. So everybody was kind of right in the poll. It happens very quickly. So our hypothesis in this whole thing was teat ends can change or crack due to a cellular stress, and they dehydrate really quickly, just like your finger does. So they crack in the winter, they dehydrate. And if you think about it, the teat's like your finger. It's an extremity, so it gets vasoconstriction. You get competition for blood flow. And in fact, what's worse is the teat is in a cold spot. It's near the ground. So maybe the thing to think about is, how do your fingertips look and feel in the winter when you go from warm to cold? And this is the same phenomena. And that milking, because we milk them every day, that's going to accentuate it, even though it's normal, because it's going to be an irritation on the teat. So my point is that we really, when we look at teats, have to differentiate not just whether they're thick, but more importantly, whether they're roughed or cracked, like the one on the right. That's the critical piece. So I'm going to give you a very simple way to score your teats. This is the international system. It's very simple, and I'm going to try to make it. So you have these normal teats, the ones that have a ring that's smooth, or S, these rough rings where you see some roughness, but it's very hard to see that thickening, and then those ones that are really bad. I'm just going to say you can do this 1, 2, 3, or 4 and just categorize your herd. But if you looked at our data, it simply goes like this. Teats that have a roughness or a cracking, the international system said, should be less than 20% of your herd. So we should have at least 80% in these top two categories that are normal with minimal mastitis risk. I think if you saw our data, I think 20% is a lot. I think that should be less than 10%. Giving some of the sizes and shapes of teats, and most importantly, there should never be more than 5% in that very, very bad category. 4.5 and 5 are very rough. So it's quick to really just go in and score your herd quick, get your numbers, and then if your numbers are much higher than this, you better think about it. But if you have some small numbers in these, before you start changing dips and things, ask yourself, do they have bad moms and dads? Do they essentially have teat end sizes and shape that just normally are going to look bad, even in the face of good milking machines and good procedures? So that's a kind of quick way to look at teat scoring, adopted and used internationally from teaching research and extension. The second piece is, when we look at temperatures, how cold does it have to get? And you saw some of the temperatures, or I'll show them to you in a minute. This is a slide that Jeff Renaud put together a long time ago, and it really talks about frozen tissue. And you can see the ability to freeze. We say certainly above zero, especially if there's not a lot of wind, probably not. But you're going to see when we get wind chill, and then we talk about even minus 25 degrees. And getting there is really factors of air temperature and wind speed. And so you can see what happens. Even at some pretty warm temperatures, when wind speed gets above 20 or 25, you can have wind chill that's devastating. On the other hand, even down at some of these low levels, when we get colder temperatures, even a slight wind can really drop that. But again, I think what this says is if we can minimize wind, we can deal with a lot of temperatures and minimize the freezing issues. So what I'd like to do is just turn quickly to some of our research. Once we did this, we embarked on a whole host of winter dip trials, including the first year we did this trial. And I just really want to share with you more, again, some lessons we learned as we look at strategies for the future. So this is the first study, and this is actually the year that I showed you already, and we were looking at TEATs. And the yellow line is going to be temperature in all these, and you can see that temperature was going up and down. And as that temperature went up and down, every time it dropped, we would see cracking go away. You can see. So this is where we knew that changing temperatures were really important. I'd also share with you that we were looking at salves at this time. We'll talk about salves later, but salves don't give you any appreciable better amount of controlling issues dealing with temperature. And in fact, they have more mastitis problems. But lesson number 4 is this one. If you look, there's some cold temperatures, but there's temperatures up here in the 20s and 30s, and we see lots of teats cracking. So yeah, we have to get pretty cold to freeze, but this phenomenon of cracking and teat end problems can happen even above 0 or even above 32 if we see some temperatures like I told you, 37 degrees and wind chill when it was 60 degrees. We see some of this even in fall. So that same winter, we followed that out, and I'm just going to show you. This is, again, we're looking at temperatures, and you can see the ups and down changes. But a winter dip was just being experimentally looked at, and it was a high emollient one. We'll talk about those later. And what I want to point out is I maybe lied to you, because you can see this is one of the coldest times. This is a 6-day stretch that was below 0. It was actually 10 below 0 for about 6 days. And the teats actually didn't get bad, and the reason is these cows had the ability to stay inside the barn, which was about 47 to 50 degrees. So sure, when it gets cold, if you can keep the cows totally cold, totally warm, you won't have that problem. Now what I want to show you, though, is the next slide. So for the next week, these cows went outside, and it was 20 to 30 degrees. But because they'd been in 50 for so long, look what happened to those teats. So it's really the relative degree of change and that the animal sees within a day or within a few days from warm to cold, and the adjustment that really is a situation. I'd also show you, if you look at this trial over the course of this year, we used that winter dip, and again, there were certain times where it got really cold where we'd see a slight advantage to the winter dip, but certainly best management practices work very well. So the following year, we decided, well, things happen in the fall, so we better start using winter dips early. And this is a full year study. This is only about 6 months of it, where we looked at normal dips and propylene glycol. And you can see when it's not very cold, there's not much use for winter dips. And then once you do get cold, that's maybe where we see they'll have some use. So we'll talk about that later. So lesson number 5 was simply there's very little difference in teat ends between good effective dips and practices and best management practices and novel winter dips unless you get to some really, really unique situations and circumstances in winter. Lesson number 6 is simply this. Even with any dip, whether it's commercial or winter, and best management practices, and even last year, this is 15 years later after we started doing this work, and we certainly have better barns and better practices. Last winter, we saw major teat end changes. Cracking last winter. In fact, in some herds up to 70% because of the weather changes. The last slide I'll show you before we get into the practices is this one. And when you look at this data, which is average skin score, could be average teat score, you can see the ups and downs. And this is sort of the middle of the winter out through March. And what people would say, well, yeah, that's just different dips and things. Well, I'm gonna show you. This is a year where the dip in all these barns is the same, and in fact it's a high emollient, high glycerin based dip. It's a winter dip. So why do we see all these ups and downs? Well, the green line, you can see it got real cold at day 0. And anything that was outside in free stalls that was seeing that cold instantly actually had some teat skin problems. The tie stalls, it took a few days till they got out in that cold, and then you can see that blue line go up. But you can see the free stalls with inside feeding, those cows adjusted much better to the cold because they're used to it, and sure, they saw some ups and downs over those 90 days. The free stalls with outside feeding, you can see, still seeing a lot of those changes rapidly because, again, those cows go in the barn, but they're going out to an outside bunk, so they're getting warm and cold. And the biggest fluctuations are in the tie stalls. And again, if you think about tie stalls, those cows are warm, and the colder it gets, the less they go out, but they oftentimes go out and feed. So lesson number 7 is even the best dips can look dramatically different given the barn, the things you're doing on your farm. And the other thing is it's really important when you make your evaluations. Oftentimes people, their cell count goes up, they see some bad teats, and they want to change a dip or anything. If you look at this, the changes oftentimes are already being made, and things are going to get better even without some of those changes. So what I want to do is then turn the last part of this to strategies and priorities for teat health and milk quality. And so I'm going to open a poll and ask you which one of these, and you only pick one, do you think is the most important priority for teat health and milk quality? So I will open the poll.
Very good. Polls are now.
There we go.
And
we're launching.
Okay. Well, Mike, what do you think?
Well, I've even though I love nutrition, I'm going to stay with stalls and barn environment. But
well, that actually sounds good to me too, Mike. So
okay,
let's see how we do on this one.
Well, we're off and running, and I tell you, it must be the weather, December, because we're up to almost 60% of the votes. Leo, either you've got easy answers or great thinking or stimulating our people, but we're at 70%. So, Leo, let's close her off and share what people are thinking. Kind of interesting.
All right, Mike, I think it's great. And actually, I think about when we first started this whole thought process about winter and where we're at now, I think maybe we've made some headway in getting people to think. First of all, my question was priority for teat health and milk quality. I didn't necessarily say winter. And so certainly cold weather if it's winter, but all the things, I'm glad people said stalls and barn environment, milk and equipment, not much in the teat dip and nutrition area, although I'm going to convince you they're very important, and they're the one that really get picked on in winter with teat dips. So there it is. So 51% stalls and environment, 35% equipment, a little bit on dips and nutrition, only about 8% on cold weather. But again, the question didn't necessarily say winter. But I'm going to convince you a little bit about how important it is in controlling that weather or that wind chill when we get to winter. But these certainly are all important. Excellent job. I'll hide that, and I'll get back into going on to this. So I want to start right here. I think if we're going to think about mastitis and milk quality, we should always think about this. Number one, the teat end is incredibly important. Having good tissue, so we're talking about when that gets compromised, what are the risks? No matter if that teat's compromised or not, this is number one. The bacteria, minimize that bacteria that are going to get on, especially when you have compromised teats. So we should be thinking about milking time in the barn and where teats get bacteria. And then on the other side, sometimes that happens. We still want to think about immunity and nutrition and some of those other things that control essentially that animal's immunity and controlling disease. So I'm going to go down these in my prevention and control strategies. Number one, I do want to talk a little bit about weather, because if we can control some of that wind and weather, we should be doing that, particularly in winter. And then we'll talk about some of these other areas that we should be doing a good job, but maybe even enhance the job we're doing when we get into the winter situation. So I think a lot of our barn environments have changed over the last 10 to 15 years. But number one, if it is that cold temperature change, that's really temperature, humidity, and wind, it's trying to control that. So if we are outside having some kind of wind break, if we can drop that wind speed down or that draft down, animals can tolerate -20 pretty easily without much of a problem. So most of us now are feeding and housing indoors where possible, avoiding drafts. When you are indoors, avoiding drafts and humidity, opening doors in freestall barns and leaving them open, doors in tie stalls, because that wind comes in those areas and just whistles down and creates drafts. So we really want to think about that. I think one that most people have tried to minimize now is making animals go out into a direct wind chill post-milking, and that really was a risk because things would freeze pretty quickly. The point on all this is temperature changes are devastating. It's the change. So oftentimes still in tie stall barns, those animals are being, if they're being fed outside, those animals stay in a warmer environment more and more the colder it gets, and then they get let out. And it's actually that initial cold shock for a short period of time that creates some real problems. So if we can do anything of this, particularly, these are more focused on controlling winter weather. Oh, sorry about that. So let's go in the barn. That's where we want her to be, and I think we should be in the barn. Number one, because cows are going to spend 20-some hours here. So if we're going to control some of these things, and we talk about drafting and moisture, we need to think about our barn environments and make it as best conducive to not get those conditions. But I'd like to go back to my other slide, which is controlling organisms, irrespective of what that teat looks like, but certainly winter. And we all hear this: clean, dry, and comfortable. Well, the issue I always get into is people say, oh, but it's cold in the barn. Everything's frozen. I don't need to worry about my stalls because frozen germs don't move. Well, I'm going to show you a piece of data that came out of Jeff Renault's shop. And what it said was all stalls are warm. If you have comfortable stalls, just like your bed at night, it might be cold, but once you lay down, that stall is going to warm up very quickly, just like your bed at night. And in fact, in a matter of minutes, that stall will be no less than 10 degrees below your body temperature. So where these cows are laying down is somewhere between 92 to 98 degrees, even if it's 20 below zero out. And what it says is that can grow a lot of organisms, and stall maintenance and cleanliness is imperative. And don't just say that organisms don't grow. So that's a little bit about stalls. It's quick, but it's important. Let's go into milking time. So the cow comes in, she's ready to be pre-milked, and there's a lot of things we do that have the potential to help that teat or essentially irritate it. So if you think about what we're trying to do pre-milking, we're trying to maximize the disinfection we get and the skin conditioning, but in the meantime, in those steps, minimizing any excess irritation or trauma that might occur, particularly when those teats are cracked. And when we combine all those, it's really about maximizing that animal's letdown so she milks out quickly and the unit is on the shortest amount of time. Why I think pre-dip has been a great addition to all of us is pre-dip is a very passive situation. It gets that teat disinfection, skin conditioning, and all the nooks and crannies. It's fairly passive. It minimizes irritation, but it gets the job done. Certainly most of us taking water and things out, things that enhance chilling. And then we dry. And I want you to think about it. We tell people to be aggressive in drying and stripping, but I want you to think about drying and drying and stripping to do the best job you can, but try not to be excessive to minimize irritation. And I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. Sorry, I keep getting off my slide. I apologize for that. I'll use my page up and page down. So I want you to think about milking, because milking, there are a lot of things that do go on that teat, and yet it's a matter of a few minutes or a few seconds for cows. So it's thinking about the people behind it, thinking about the dips we use and get them in the place where they disinfect and give us good skin conditioning pre and post. And then I'll just share with you, this is a dairy in northwest Iowa. This dairy had some other problems with teat hens too, but they developed a kind of drying blotting technique. You can see they use cloth towels. But they kind of dry blot, and they're very good at stripping. And again, this is a herd that had some problems with teat hens, and just trying to do a job, get that dip off, stimulate the cow, but not excessively irritate that teat. So again, I think we can be pretty aggressive in our drying and stripping, but we start to get to winter where those teats just get a little cracked like your fingers. We really need to think about maybe adjusting some of our procedures to minimize some of that extra irritation. Yeah. I think I'll leave my mouse alone. So that's the people, and that's kind of pre-milking and maybe a little bit of post-milk. I want to talk a little bit about equipment. I can't make everybody an expert, but certainly the equipment goes on the cow, and it needs to function properly in terms of milking the cow, but it can certainly be an irritant. And it is. I'm going to convince you that the machine, even the best machine, is an irritant or a stressor on that teat, and we're just trying to optimize or minimize that. But the first point I want to make, and I left this slide, Jim Balls didn't necessarily like it. We'd like to have these fancy, pristine cows, but I put this in for a reason. Because milking equipment and milking procedures can get a dirty udder maybe clean, but they don't fix poor cow hygiene. And I oftentimes see in the winter where people say, well, the cows, you know, nothing's, like I said, nothing's growing in the barn. You know, things aren't there, so those germs aren't growing. Well, in fact, those germs are growing. And in fact, one of the #1 reasons we see for problems in the winter, particularly cracked teats, is hygiene in stalls. But let's assume we're doing a good job of hygiene. Then I think number one, and it's even before we get into winter, making sure we're changing those parts that need to be changed that influence that teat and influence milking. Certainly inflations, things like vacuum hoses, milk hose, those rubber parts, particularly inflations, because when they start to wear out, again, they start to change how that machine interacts and stresses the teat. The other part of that is somewhere you're going to need a competent serviceman to come out. Make sure that your system is working well in terms of vacuum levels and flows so that we're getting those cows milked out cleanly and efficiently, not slowing down milking, but not necessarily hurting teats any more than need to be. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this, but I want you to just think about it. This is a pulsator graph, and we know that cows need massage on those teats or they get sore and congested. This is a good example. Go into time after time into facilities. This is a parlor with 4 units, and when you run the pulsator graph, you can see at least 2 of those pulsators are not completely massaging a teat. Now in this barn, they weren't seeing a lot of those issues manifested until they got the cracked teats. So my point on this is we oftentimes have these little problems in milking practices, in our equipment, that are a problem, but they don't really blow out of proportion till we get winter, we get those cracks on the teats. Like, again, like drumming your fingers. You realize how much you drum your fingers on a desk and it never hurts until the winter, and then all of a sudden you do all these other things. So certainly having thorough system checks, maintaining that equipment, and make sure your milking procedures and protocols are in place long before winter. But certainly once winter comes, we really make sure we amplify those. So if you think about milking, it's a cow, a machine, and people, and they interact to create time interactions. One of the greatest problems we see in risk is when that unit stays on the cow longer than it has to, because the longer it's on, or the longer it's on inappropriately, is one of the single greatest factors that's going to irritate that teat, particularly, and accentuate things, particularly in winter. So I think the first one is, we talked about having an excellent pre-milking routine in place with cleaning and stimulation and sanitation, and thinking about some of those things and trying to minimize some of the irritation and getting that milker unit on so we optimize milk letdown and milk out. The second one, so that's the front side of milking. On the back side, again, is minimizing over milking, whether we have detachers or not. Again, having a unit on that cow when it's time to come off is just going to irritate a teat, and that will essentially be a problem, especially when we have cracks on those teats. So I'm going to turn my next one. So that's really milking. And if you think about milking in stalls, they're the same kind of things we're doing all the time, but now we really need to amplify even better and not get into this trap that germs don't freeze, and think about the things we do at milking time that might be even more irritating, and can we dampen those. So I'm going to open the next poll, and I've left this to last, and you didn't say much about this in the polls, but this used to be the #1 place people jumped. And now I think people are looking at the right thing. So I'm going to share this poll and say, what's the best winter teat dip option?
Well, Steve, I think I'm with you, and the polls are open, and we're really off and running again. I tell you,
good voting today. People must be really busy, and they just want to get this going and get back to work. So they're voting quick.
Yep, we got over 50% in, Leo, so get ready, get ready. They're starting to slow down a little bit. It must be some more Republicans out there, because they're really slowing down. We used to be at 80% at this point, and we're only at 63%, but we're going to close her off. Leo, let's...
Better question than we thought, huh?
Yeah, I'll close her off, and I'll share with everybody.
That's good.
And maybe the one with this one compared to the other ones is people do waffle around, and they're saying, well, I don't know. What do I do? So it's interesting. If you look at this, the highest percentage you can see, 44, I think everybody can see that, is using a winter dip, either a powder or a high emulsion. We'll talk about those. 32% said use a normal lactating cow dip, which really, if you, we'll come back to that, okay? 12% said a chlorine dioxide. We'll talk about that. A few for salves, and even though we talked about this no dipping or no salves, nothing, maybe we haven't, we'll come back, and 10%, so that was certainly #4 in the poll, right behind chlorine dioxide. So I'll hide that, and I'll jump into what might be maybe the most controversial, but I think it's actually fairly straightforward. So as we started to look at this, and for years it was always post-milking teat dipping. It was really to dip or not to dip. That was the question. And then we understood what winter was. We understood lots of new ideas. And so it really then became not so much, but what dip or what practice should we use? And we had a myriad of things come, winter dips, things like that. I'm going to convince you today, part of the big thing is what happens with the drop or what happens at the end. Although the side becomes pretty important, we'll talk about it, but especially when you have any kind of liquid, what's going on with the drop at the end? Because that's where a lot of problems occur. So if you think about teat tipping, you take a step back. For years we wanted to kill germs, and we realized we could kill germs, but maybe at the expense of skin conditioning, and then we'd have problems. So you need them both. They're not mutually exclusive, and I think we've done an excellent job on those. But when you dip, you want to minimize risk for anything, and in fact, cold. And that's why we talked about not dipping cows going out into wind chill. My point is, are we trying to avoid all risk or manage risk? And farmers manage risk, and we help them manage risk, and that's what I want to talk about today, managing the risk. So I'm going to tell you, if you looked at my graphs from before, the dip of choice in most times in the winter should just be the normal dips we're using. The weather's not conducive to it. Normal lactating cow dips with the appropriate amount of skin conditioners work very well, even with some best management practices. Okay? Most of those are going to have 5 to 10% conditioners, maybe multiple conditioners, but you saw already that a lot of times they'll work. A couple of things I want to think about. Never change those. Never add any extra conditioners, because that dramatically changes the chemistry and oftentimes inactivates the germicide. So that's the lactating cow dip, and it does work in a lot of situations. One thing we know in our early studies, and there's studies from Washington and others, if you use any of those dips and that drops at the end, if you just, like you saw before, just blot or dab that in dry with a cloth, just move very quickly. We've been in herds, it takes very little time to do that, and in fact, you can have the same conditions with that as you get with a lot of other dips. But again, you've got to be willing to do that. It's essentially controlling that drop at the end. I didn't have barrier dips in there, but some people do use lactating barrier dips. I think those become problems in the winter, and we pull those out. Why? They're barriers. They tend to be thick. They tend to have a big thickness on the end. They take a long time to dry, and oftentimes they're more prone to freeze because that teat's going to be wet for a longer period of time. And certainly those barriers really get hard to get off sometimes at the end in the winter, and it can be really irritating. So we tend to pull those out, not even make them a choice. So here's the one that 44% voted for. And actually, all these dips came after we did our study and showed the industry, hey, it's not your dips, it's not your inflations, but this is what's happening. The caveat, and you saw my slides, I think they work, but look at the top of this line. They work in cold temperatures only. They're for extremely cold temperatures or changes in temperature. Okay, but they have risks. Okay, so they're useful, but they have risks. In the dry powder dip, if you look at this one, part of the risk is just simply getting it applied. And I'm going to convince you, if you can't get an application of this, including all up and down the skin, you're going to have problems. We see people that have a hard time applying this, and it's blotchy, and we don't get application. We see some of the worst dried skin. So again, I think do a good job. Make sure you get an application. Second thing with this and the high emollient dips is this is a dry dip, this is an oily dip. When that cow goes to lay in a stall, if it's dirty, they're both going to wick things onto them. So these dips are very good. They minimize risk going out in the barn and cold, but they actually maybe amplify the risk a little bit of an unclean stall. So again, make sure you have clean stalls. And they have a little bit higher price, but again, frozen teats cost, or teat cracks and problems cost money. On the high emollient dip, it's the opposite. It's not dry, it's actually a higher emollient. And in fact, if you look at it, most of them have 50 to 70% skin conditioners, mostly propylene glycol. So if you think about it, it's antifreeze. And when you put antifreeze on your finger, what happens is it evaporates slow. So it changes the evaporation and the cooling. And that's how these dips work. They evaporate slow and control that initial cold. Now, if this cow goes out in the wind for an hour, she'll freeze a teat. So if you think about it. The other thing, again, the risk of these is now these teats are very, very oily. They have a glycol or glycerol. They're wet for a couple hours. And in fact, that's protecting them. But again, when they go lay down, it may have a propensity to adhere things on it, especially in dirty stalls. So my point on these, I think they're very useful. People use them. I think the poll shows that they do. But I just want you to think about it. There are big risks, and you have to pay a little more for them. But if you And if you don't manage those risks, we've seen a lot of problems with them. So good choice. Again, when we get out of the cold temperatures, these become bad choices because then when it's warm, they tend to capture a lot of things, and we've looked at that data, and they don't work very well, and they tend to enhance mastitis problems. The last one I had up there is chlorine dioxide, and this is a dip that's been out a long time, but it tends to get a lot of press from particularly some consultants. And I just want to make a comment about why and what it does and what it actually does. So chlorine dioxide, you can see, it's oftentimes the dips you see with the base and the activator. They're mixed daily or sometimes every 12 hours, and that gets the germicide going. It's a very, very effective germicide, by the way. So when you dip with this, people say, well, I've done this, and I'm going to use these in winter because it exfoliates dead skin. I can go down to the end, and I can rub off that callus, and I don't get cracking. I'm going to put a question mark. Actually, I should put an exclamation point. It does not exfoliate dead skin. We've done that work, and we've done this head-to-head in half udder designs. What it does, though, that chemistry allows that teat end, especially when it cracks or gets thick, to remain soft. That drop on the end keeps it hydrated, keeps that tissue soft and pliable. So again, it can be rubbed off or so that it stays healthy. Again, think of your finger. When you crack it, what makes it worse is when it dries out and it gets hard. So this tends to keep it. I'm going to share with you, you're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years, dips that are going to come out in winter that are just like this, where a lot of attention has been paid to how fast that dip will dry on the end and what that drop will do in the end to enhance that ability for that teat to stay soft and pliable. And that's really what it's all about. So it's either protecting it from winter with powder emollients or having something that can really do a nice job at the end of the teat. I leave these two to the end, and they had a few choices, but I think they're bad choices. I already showed you. Quit dipping, and 9% said that. It's a bad option. Now, if you're going to dip and you're going to have a catastrophic event, maybe it's an okay option. But if you think about not dipping, the teats are still wet. So if they go out into the cold, they're prone to get cold. They've had no skin conditioner, and actually they will dehydrate much, much faster than any other thing. And essentially you have no contagious mastitis control. Oops, hit the wrong button again. Leave my mouse aside. Salves you've already seen. I showed you data, and we've done that time and time again. They don't protect teats, especially some of those watery-based ones. More importantly, all they do is make things greasy. They trap infections. They wick things on. And the data is pretty crystal clear that they can help Staph aureus and things colonize and grow and maintain infections. So my point is, if you're going to use the salve, number one, use the right one. Things like Novosan cream with an effective germicide and skin conditioner, and only use it where you need it, which is maybe a little bit on the end to help some of those teat ends. Certainly not all over your pants and in your inflations. So I hope today you saw that maybe winter just says bring a little bit of TLC. I want to talk about 2 or 3 other points real quickly that I didn't even put on there. But number one is when we get into winter and our cell counts go up, oftentimes people start making changes, but really don't know how many cows we're talking about, what group and population. And this should be the same in all mastitis situations, no matter what time of the year. We need an active monitoring program to define how many cows we're talking about, who they are, and define where those risks and things are coming, particularly winter or other things. So have an active monitoring system where we can look at new cases and pick those up very quickly. Clinical mastitis too. The second one I want to convince you, we should be doing this all year round, but winter, and even not winter, monitoring transition in fresh cows. High-risk animals for mastitis. We know the highest risk animals. And I think we can do things like look at clinicals like swollen quarters and abnormal secretions, or look at their first cell count, but that's past when they calved, or paddle test them as a fresh cow, or culture them. We should be intense on these transition of fresh cows no matter what. But the point I want to make is right here. Most of you have seen, particularly in winter, but sometimes in summer, you get edema. That skin on the end, on that teat, dries, kind of gets cracky. And when it does, it's very, very prone to pick up infections, particularly Staph aureus. And I'll show you in the next slide. Coupled with all this looking, is sooner or later, if you're having some problems, culture a few of those cows. Because you really want to, if you're starting to get a staph or a contagious problem very quickly, you really need to jump on it quick. You need to know that. And if it's not, you still need to worry about environmentals. But the reason I think this is so important is right here. Staph aureus loves wounds. You may be in a herd that hardly has any of it. But when you start to get fresh cows and heifers and they get edema and they get that flaky skin, probably that amplifies the risk about 100% that they're going to pick up aureus, even if you don't have many cows with aureus. And certainly when we start to see these cracks at teat ends in the winter. And the important thing is this: Staph aureus is just like a hospital. It's a wound invader. It's the #1 thing. So getting on this. The other thing that's really important about this is we know that if you can get to some of these staph infections early, particularly in heifers, we'll have a much greater success of things like therapy. All too often what happens in winter, we pick these up, particularly in heifers. We're worried it's now summer, our cell counts are high, we go back and look, we don't have any new infections, it's all from winter. And by then a lot of those heifers and cows are chronic and our chances of doing anything are pretty slim. So Mike mentioned nutrition and he didn't vote, but I want to talk just really quickly and make a quick comment about nutrition. I might put it last, except I want to make this point. Good teat health depends on good nutrition. I've been in farms side to side in the winter that almost have the same risks and issues, and the one that has a poor nutrition program will have poor teat ends. And we don't tend to think about this. Nutrition is important in healing. And when we start to see these issues that compromise either that animal's immunity or cuts, cracks, metritis, we don't tend to put teat ends in that, but teat end health really hinges on good nutrition. So having a solid nutrition program for that whole issue of immunity and tissue healing. The other one, and this might be a rude reminder and it has nothing really to do with teat ends, is you already heard today one of the worst problems is fluctuating temperatures. And with that, going from cold to warm, and it's happened this year, is fluctuating intakes. And I hate to put this up, but how often we see more DAs, more hemorrhagic bowel in the winter, particularly when it gets warm, then all of a sudden a cold snap comes and the cows have been backing off the feed bunk and now we know it gets cold, it's 10 below zero and they're eating us out of house and home, our feed costs go out. Well, those rapid changes in feed intake are probably one of the major reasons we see some of these other problems. And again, trying to think about how we might control that fluctuation. So with that in mind, I think we've come a long way. I still have time for questions, but I'd like to summarize. And summary goes like this. I hope you have a better appreciation today for what's normal. Too often, when winter used to happen, we'd make rash decisions. We'd look at the worst teats and think they were everybody. We'd change inflations. We'd change this. We'd blame the equipment dealer. Went in saw today. A lot of those things will happen, and maybe those aren't the teats we should be making all our decisions on. You got it today. Teat ends can change rapidly. Bad machines will do it, but certainly weather, and particularly changes in cold. And you saw it today. It isn't 24 and 36 hours. You saw in that one barn where they went out, even when it was warmer outside, but they've been in that warmer barn for 6 days. In a matter of 12 hours, actually, one barn, 97% of all teats cracked. I think thinking about facilities and environment. One is controlling weather. If you've got some excess weather issues and wind and drafts, certainly control those. But having good facilities, clean, dry, and comfortable, and again, realizing that all stalls are warm. They'll grow germs. We need to maintain a healthy, clean, comfortable stall in the winter. Followed by, again, the things we do. Not a lot of time, but we don't spend a lot of time on cows and milking, but the procedures we use, the equipments we have are incredibly critical. And especially really critical when we start to have those compromised teats, or even small things can really accentuate a problem. We talked today about being flexible, and we can talk about how you want to approach dipping or some of those other things. But again, make sure you think about those advantages well, but make sure you can manage those risks and the dollars. I wouldn't lie to you. Last winter was blistering cold. We did 10 winter dip trials last winter, and we saw some neat things, but not a single one of those totally prevented those cracks from happening. And yet in our farm, we kept our cell count low because even in the face of cracks, we could manage around that. It's just like your finger. If you crack your finger in the winter, you do things like put gloves on, put salve on. We can't necessarily do that with cows, but we really need to make sure we have all those other things in place that should have been there anyway to do that. So it's really about maximizing the objectives and strategies we use all year long and basically make them better. With that, I'd like to thank you, Hoards Dairyman, Kuhn, for you listening, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that anybody would have. Thank you.
Very good, Leo. Well, listen, Steve, we'll turn it back to you, and you can maybe tell us a little bit about what's going to happen in the future, and maybe click to the next PowerPoint, Leo.
Very good. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Leo, for a great presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I think you gave all of us a lot to think about. Very well done and very interesting. So we thank you for that. Just want to spin ahead here to our next webinars. For those of you that are out there feeding for transition success, Mike Hutchins will be our presenter for our January webinar, and our February webinar will be Greg Bethard, who's now with Pagels Ponderosa Dairy up here in Wisconsin, on nailing the big dollar decisions. So again, Leo, thank you very much for a good job. Our thanks to Kuhn for their support for this webinar, and I want to remind you that those of you who have been with us today will receive a very brief survey here in a couple of days by email. We appreciate your response on that. Also, this webinar and all of our previous webinars are available for you and your colleagues and cohorts. They're all archived for your access. Just go to hoards.com and click on the webinars, and you can view them as well. Mike, I'm not sure if we have any questions out there. I actually have a couple. I would have a couple myself, but let's see what you have for Leo as we wrap up here.
Very good. Leo, we got some quick ones here for you. First of all, what about warming the teat dip itself before placing it on the cow, both the pre and post pre-dip? Should that be in a pail of water? Should they be kept at a warmer temperature rather than the cold temperature? We're talking about dipping the dip itself.
Yeah, Mike, when you look at that, trying to put that in water, number one, that creates an issue. Then you got a wet, sloppy dipper, number one. Number two, I don't think it can effectively, even if you're in a parlor, most of them have supplemental heat, or even in a stall barn, that I think there's enough warmth that small amount of dip that gets on, that's not going to change very much. The one concern I have is I've seen some people try to heat up dips and make it hot, and I've actually seen where you put it on, and some of that heat, although it doesn't seem like a lot, will actually irritate teats. So I get real concerned about controlling that heat, controlling a lot of water being around, and so I don't think it will have much benefit.
Another question about sire selection. How do we know which sires will improve teat ends shape?
That's interesting. Great point. Nobody really looks at that. We look at udder, we look at a lot of things, but we don't do a lot of classification of teat size and shape. And it's not just the end. It's length, it's width. Oftentimes, Mike, a lot of those cows cull themselves. But the point I really wanted to bring, and we know that sometimes cows with bad teats end up, and so we've probably done a lot of self-selection. But the real point in looking at that is really, for years, people were taking some of those cows who did have bad mom and dads, and they were making all their decisions in their farm. Okay, their cell count went up. They'd look at that one cow. They didn't have to get underneath her, and they'd say, "Oh, I got to change dips. I got to do that." When in fact, the point I was trying to make is that those shapes are normal, just in a normal distribution of pick and sire. So I'm not sure how you'd pick them. You'd probably look at the females in your herd and think about minimizing those.
Okay, next question. Chlorine dioxide post-dip drop to be blotted also. Is that true? We need to be blotting that?
Right. The answer on that one would probably be no. That drop is fine. From what we've seen, again, that drop, number one, it dries relatively quickly. And that's the point. We're looking at some new dips now that, a lot of it is you dip that cow and she walks out of that parlor, or even in a stall barn, but certainly a parlor. By the time you get them all dipped, it's less than a minute or so. But we see a lot of dips now that people are looking at that really can dry relatively quickly, and yet enhance that compound on the end. So in the chlorine dioxides and some of the ones you're going to see coming, you won't see any blotting dry. And again, that's a chore, so that's why most people won't do it.
There's a follow-up question on blotting. Can I use the same towel or piece of paper to blot several cows as I go down the row, and is paper better than cloth?
Yeah, it's a great point, because everybody says, I'm touching every teat, I'm going to spread mastitis. There's a risk. You're not going to use an individual towel or cloth for every cow. It will take too long. It will cost money. You saw the one where some people will use it. They'll blot dry with a single towel. They'll oftentimes use cloth. Paper towels don't work very well. Cloth seems to wick it off. Again, you don't have to rub. You just get near it. It wicks it off. You don't really almost have to touch the teat. And again, I look at this and I'll say, you're thinking about risk. Okay, you've just dipped the teat, you've hopefully killed all those germs, your risk of the potential to move them by a simple blotting would be minimal. Now, in a very, very highly contagious mastitis herd, that's probably something I wouldn't do, but in a well-managed herd, we have people do it and it works.
A follow-up question seems to strike a nerve here. What about time blotting? Do I have to wait 60 seconds before I blot off that post-dip?
Most of the data would say a lot of these dips, 30 seconds, and most of them will effectively kill multiple log folds. None of them totally kill everything, but if you look at it, it's particularly the concentration on the end. So you don't put it on, take it right off. But normally what we'll do is people will dip aside, and then maybe what they would do is they would go quickly back and just barely touch the ends. We've done it up to a 500 and 600 cow dairy with actually no appreciable time added onto it. But again, it has to be built into a routine. It has to be done the way we're talking about it. The way I see this playing out in the future, we're going to see a lot of dips where this won't even be thought about, because we'll see some things that are lactating cow dips, but we'll have that enhancement on the teat end.
If I'm in an environment, can I hold the cow after she's milked rather than having her all outside? It might be in an exit lane. It might be in a rapid freestall. Would you encourage that change in management to keep the cows in a warmer environment for 30 seconds or a minute?
You know, when I look at it, most people going out of particularly a parlor, they're going to go out to a walk alley that's probably going to be cold. Most of them aren't warm. Maybe a little bit warm because there's cows in there. And you might do that. But again, what I'd be more concerned about in those walk lanes and alleys, particularly if their curtains are not, is minimizing drafts. You go into a lot of those and there's a curtain ripped or something and there's just wind going through. So I've been in those situations. If you control, again, curtains and things and control any kind of drafting, I don't see any problem letting that animal out and go walk all the way down to the freestall. I don't think getting into the freestall is going to create an issue. In fact, sometimes there's a lot less drafting and certainly a lot more air volume down that freestall in terms of cold than there is in some of these walk lanes where there's a lot of, again, air comes in one end or comes in a door and you get a lot of high velocity air moving at that ground level that makes it pretty cold. So we let animals out. I don't think that's going to be that big an issue.
Here's an interesting question. What about spray versus foam versus liquid? I'm not sure if that's cold weather, and we're talking about post-dipping. Any comments on that?
Well, I think the most important thing about dipping, whether it's pre or post, use an effective dip, get the whole teat covered, okay, get skin conditioning on it, okay. How you choose to do that, whether that's foaming, spraying, or dipping, they all take a little different. It takes a little more to get them sprayed and get good coverage, particularly post-milking, where you're trying to get that whole teat, not just the end, although the end becomes important. Foaming works. I have a little bit of concern about foaming post-dipping because it depends. Some of the older foamers that it's like shaving cream, although you get a lot of emollient on there, again, you have real thick foam that can create some situations about how long it takes to dry, and especially if those cows go back and lay down. So I think any of those work. Depends on what that farm wants to manage. Most important thing is they got to get adequate coverage, not only from the germicide but the skin conditioner, and hopefully put it in a situation where it'll dry before they get to a stall.
Well, Steve, I think we've covered most of the questions on our end here. I'll turn it back to you at this point.
Well, thank you, Mike, very much. Leo, I just had one question on teat scoring. Teat and scoring, is that something we can do on the farm, our staff ourselves, or should we have somebody else to come in and give us an objective thing? The other thing is, let's say you've got 500 cows, what percentage of them from each string should you do, and do you do sort of a random thing to get a good handle on it?
Great question, Steve. When we developed the system internationally, we were involved at Teat Club International. We designed it so that anybody could use it. Now, again, when you're looking at your own herd, you need to be objective, and maybe you want someone else to score. But it's relatively quick to look at. Really, it's looking at a cow, and oftentimes all four teats score the same, and that depends on parallel par or some other things. But so you might just score the cow, and you say 1, 2, 3, or 4, or maybe you'll do individual teats. But at the end, just get a distribution, and you can look at what those numbers, like we said, play out to be in terms of cracked percentages or very rough teats.
Very good.
Let me.
Leo,
I'll answer the last question that which you asked, and it'll be very quick.
go ahead.
Our data would say if you have 100 cows, you do them all. You start getting larger numbers. You get to 400 or 500. You want to do at least 20% of the herd. So
Okay.
at least 80 to 100 cows. And more importantly, is you do the pens where you think you're going to see the greatest risks. So I'm going to tell you, I like to look at fresh cows, even though they don't have a lot of thickening on their teeth because they haven't been milking. But I really like to look for the cracking and dryness. And then really I like to look at those early to mid-lactation cows, the ones that have been in milking long enough where machines will have had an issue with the end, or the ones with bigger udders, more milk, they're more prone to crack quicker than, say, a late lactation cow.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, Leo, great job. Very nicely done. Kuhn, we appreciate their support very much. Always thanks to Mike Hutchins and Jim Baltz down at the University of Illinois for their cooperation and support. And thank you for all that have joined us. And we look forward to having you back with us in January when Mike Hutchins will be our presenter. That's all for now from Fort Atkinson.